So here's a fun fact for you. Did you know that Prestige put out records on 16 RPM format? Or more specifically, 16 2/3 RPM. So this is a little bit of a blip in Prestige's history, where there were actually 6 albums put out between 1957 and 1958 on 16 RPM. And that's a little bit of a weird format. Probably a lot of us don't have records that are 16 RPM. And in fact, most turntables don't really accommodate for that. Obviously, with few exceptions. You may have some vintage turntables. I happen to have one here that has a setting actually for 16 as well as 78 RPM, in addition to 33 and 45. And then some turntables have sort of a variable speed where you can dial in exactly how fast you want it to spin. But by and large, I would say most of us probably have turntables made within the last 20, 30 years or so, and we don't have that option. We're limited to 33 and 45. And so I think most of us just aren't aware of the fact that at one point there were 16 2/3 RPM discs. And that is the topic that I want to talk about. I want to talk about these 6 releases. And talk to you about a little bit about the history, as far as I know, at least why this format exists, and yeah, we'll kind of dig into it. I think this is going to be really interesting because at the same time that some of these Prestige releases on 16 RPM were essentially reissues or perhaps released at the exact same time as 12-inch counterparts, some of this stuff was released first on 16 RPM and then didn't see the light of day again for another 7 or 8 years before it was put out again. So I'm always interested in finding this stuff in the original format, and it sure is interesting when that original format is on 16 RPM. So let's dive in. So why 16 RPM? Well, so just from a mathematics standpoint, so if you consider 33 1/3 RPM as sort of your baseline, and what 1.5 times that is around about 45 RPM. Well, I guess, let me think. Well, exactly half of 33 1/3 RPM is 16 2/3 RPM. So what that means, obviously, is that the turntable spins slower. And also what that means is that because it spins slower, in order to produce sound, you can fit a ton more content on a 16 RPM disc. And that's kind of interesting. So, obviously like 45 RPM spins faster, there's less content, right? So a lot of times when you have an album and all of a sudden it's made available on 45, you have to get 2 discs in order to fit it. Well, similarly, if you're spinning at half the speed, you can fit like 2 albums worth of content on a 16 RPM disc, and that is exactly what Prestige did. They put 2 albums on every single disc that they put out of this brief 6-disc or 6 LP series. So, so that could be one reason that they wanted to do this. They wanted to fit more content on for folks. Now, I think that there's a little bit more behind that. Now, 16 RPM at the time was mostly used for spoken word, books on tape. Think about that. So books on LP. And so I think that, in retrospect, I think a lot of us have this connotation that the slower the speed, the worse the quality. And I do think that that is a thing. Now, I would also say that most people, and I know that this is going to cause some feedback, but most people don't really perceive 33 versus 45 RPM on their turntables. I know that the audiophile releases prioritize 45, and I know that there are sonic improvements you can get from 45, and I'm not discounting that. But I would say that there's probably a lot of folks who don't perceive the difference, and I would especially say that with older equipment that was available in the mid-50s that somebody might be playing this stuff on. So I don't think that necessarily there was a perceived degradation of quality as much as they saw it as the opportunity to include a whole lot more content on the same disc. Now, so I think there's a couple of things at play here, and again, I think it's more content. I think that some of those academic sources or uses of the 16 RPM format, I think they were trying to get a little bit of the halo effect of, oh, this is respectable, right? This is respectable content is on 16 RPM. It's serious stuff. And actually, some of these discs are branded Modern Jazz Series, or Modern Jazz Survey, excuse me. And so I think that they were trying to lend a certain degree of respectability to the content as well, and simply make it more robust. But it's hard to unpack this. We don't exactly know why Prestige did it, but they did it. And again, there's 6 of them, and we're going to take each one in turn. All right, so how we're going to go about this, I'm going to show you my copies of some of this stuff. I'm going to show you some of the other releases that actually have the same content, so you can get a sense of what the 16 RPM disc had, where you might be able to find the same content on 33 RPM. Anyway, I'm going to show you a bunch of stuff, but I'll also do some some screen grabs up here or over here, so that you can kind of see what we're talking about in a little bit more detail, because there's a lot to show. So the first one that I want to talk about is right here. This is Modern Jazz Quartet's Concord. It also says Milt Jackson Quartet, doesn't it? And it says Prestige 1. And you can see the 16 RPM logo that we have here. So the reason why the title is a little bit confusing is because it is indeed a compilation of other content that exists elsewhere. And I actually think that these first 2 titles even had some of the sources for this content on 78 RPM, which means that not even the 33 RPM edition was the original. So what's interesting, I would suppose, outside of the fact that, take a look at that cover. And also, if that cover looks familiar to you, I'm gonna talk to you in a little bit about why it's familiar to you on actually one of these later releases. But I'll save that one for a little bit. One of the things that's interesting about this series is the labels. Now, what you can see here is the Fireworks label. This is the 44 West 50th Street, New York City label. We all recognize it. However, maybe what you don't recognize is the fact that it is white and black, as opposed to yellow and black. Now, this is not the only time that Prestige used this format. They actually did it on a couple of promo titles. I want to say in like the 7200s series. I think there was like 4 or 5, something like that. There wasn't many of them, of these like promo titles. Anyway, they used the white and black for each of the 6 that are on 16 RPM, and so that's what it looks like. And again, probably a little bit unusual looking, because we're not used to seeing that color format. So anyway, where this album is sourced from is, like I said, early content. I want to say that that some of this music was recorded in 1952, but if you're a 12-inch format, 33 RPM kind of person, where you can find the content that exists on this 16 RPM disc is you can find it on Concord with the Modern Jazz Quartet. This is catalog number 7005, and actually every single track that is on this album is on one side of the 16 RPM, and on the other side is the Milt Jackson Quartet. 7003 is the Prestige catalog number on 33 RPM. And so, what we have is really just a compilation, right, of these two titles that is being put onto this album. And this was the first in the series. And again, you can get it all here. And I know, and I'm going to continue probably to reemphasize. People are asking, yeah, but does the 16 RPM sound good? Yes, it sounds good. Does it sound excellent and detailed? I'd answer that with, do these sound excellent and detailed? Because, again, I think these are sourced by 78 RPM. Some of these are sourced by 10-inch. That stuff just didn't sound good. I don't think that you're going to perceive a difference. At least I don't really. And here's the thing. I don't hook up my record player that has the ability to play 16 RPM that frequently. So I haven't played these in a little while. I just like having them because I'm a collector. But anyway, that is the first title, and as much as those are compilations, and the next one is, some of these get more interesting and more complicated in terms of the material that they feature, and how long we would have to wait for them to be released in a 33 RPM format. All right, the next one up is Billy Taylor's Let's Get Away From It All, and talk about a fantastic cover. I just love this imagery with this helicopter kind of flying in from the side. I think it looks really cool. Good use of space here, right? So a couple of things that I want to point out about this title, and it's about how Prestige is positioning the 16 RPM format. So there's a couple of things. One is up here in the logo, and what you'll see is obviously 16 RPM, but then there's some text right below it, and that says more modern jazz at the modern speed. Modern, 16 RPM. On the back, There's a little bit more detail. It says 16, which actually stands for 16 2/3 RPM, is the modern speed in phonograph records. And so, it says the equivalent of two 12-inch 33 1/3 RPM recordings, which is true. It also says the engineering consultant is Rudy Van Gelder. So we know, obviously, Rudy Van Gelder did a lot of work for Prestige. In fact, worked on almost every single release that they had. And it's just, it's just kind of interesting that they're positioning it, though, in this way. And even at the bottom, if you'd like to be informed of future releases by Prestige Records at the modern 16 RPM speed, please send your name and address to their address. So anyway, just kind of interesting stuff in terms of how they're positioning it. And the source content, again, is material that exists on 12-inch, but also was released previously in the early 50s. And those two titles are Billy Taylor Trio Volume 1 and Volume 2. If these look vaguely familiar, but you're used to seeing them with other colors, it's because shortly after the release of these two volumes, they put out new covers, one with mostly red, one with mostly blue. But I think the image and maybe the title are maintained. But this is the original format for these two albums. These are catalog numbers 7015 and 7016, I believe. So yeah, you can certainly find this content elsewhere. But I think it's kind of fun to see it on 16 RPM. I actually remember buying this copy specifically at the Princeton Record Exchange some years ago, and was super excited to see it there. All right, these releases are starting to get a little bit more interesting, I think, with the third in the series, and that is Miles Davis and the Modern Jazz Giants. So the cover is great, certainly, although kind of interesting. It almost looks like I suppose it is kind of a locker room format, right? A lot of jazz at this time period. We started to see a lot of college visuals. Incorporated, not necessarily on Prestige typically, but just on a lot of other albums. So anyway, this is one example, and like I said, fantastic cover. So this is another title like the previous two that was released in 1957, despite the fact that the content is from 1954, and so this is again a compilation. This time it's mostly from 10-inch releases. So Prestige put out catalog numbers, and I'll show them. 200, 196, and the other one is 187. So these are each again 10-inch Miles Davis releases that had been previously put out. And there's one track that I actually think debuted possibly for the first time here, and that is from the Miles Davis and the Modern Jazz Giants album, which I think is catalog number 7109, I believe. And anyway, so there's one track from that as well that would appear on that, but for the first time. But otherwise, it is here. So as you can see in what's listed on the cover, you have sessions that represent Thelonious Monk, Sonny Rollins, Horace Silver, Percy Heath. Couple of different formats here, but really interesting stuff to have it all together again on one disc. And again, here you can see. Be careful with this. You can see the really bright label, black and white, and again these things have some of the pressing identifiers that you would expect to see. So this is the RVG stamp era and not etched, which helps us a little bit in terms of understanding exactly when it came out. But it does have AB in the run out as well, which refers to the Abbey pressing plant, right? And deep groove, and again the address that we expect to see. So a lot of those sort of pressing details are represented here and on each of these discs as well. All right, number 4 in the series. This is Trombone by Three. So let's just kind of have a value discussion here, because this title is the scarcest, or at least the hardest to, scarcest, therefore hardest to find, but hardest to afford, I would say, as well. So these albums don't typically go for very much, and the reason why is a lot of people aren't looking for them. I say they don't go for much. It used to be these things would go for like 30 or 40 bucks, I would say, about 10, 15 years ago, for really all of them, maybe except Trombone by Three. Nowadays, okay, I mean, I think you can still get those first two that I showed you probably for less than 100. Some of these other ones are creeping up there, maybe just a little bit, but maybe around like the 200 mark. This one, Trombone by Three, routinely goes for over $1,000 and sometimes multiple thousands of dollars. And the reason why, what makes this stand out versus the others is not the music. In fact, this may be the worst music, in my opinion, out of this release, is on Trombone by Three. The reason why this one is the most valuable is because of the image and because it's Andy Warhol who designed it. Now, obviously there's other Andy Warhol covers for Prestige. I think some of those are also inflated in terms of value because he did the artwork. Don't get me wrong, great artwork. But this is one of those titles that just is really egregious. One of the interesting things about this artwork is actually it was very almost, you know, sort of literal interpretation of a of some artwork elsewhere, and I'm gonna show you the source over here so that you can get a sense of what inspired again this artwork that the Andy Warhol must have looked at. So anyway, that is, in my opinion, what derives the value, because the music is not great. You can find this music elsewhere as well. And in fact, there's a 12-inch release called Trombone by Three that, in my opinion, also has really great artwork. I own a copy but didn't dig it out, but you can see it here. And then the other one is Benny Green with Strings. That is the other album. So again, the two sandwiched together here and made available in this format. The content is from, I think, around 1949 to 1954. So it's a variety of sessions that spans across those eras. And again, we're a little bit at the mercy of the recording equipment at the time in terms of how this sounds. So it does sound a little bit dated. And again, it's heavy trombone, right? You got J.J. Johnson, Kai Winding, and Benny Green, again, in a variety of formats. So don't get me wrong, there's some worthwhile stuff here. You do have Sonny Rollins, Kenny Dorham, and Max Roach. I'm trying to think who else of note perhaps is, you've got like Brew Moore and Jerry Mulligan and guys like that. So if you kind of like some of that earlier stuff, then, you'll enjoy the music here. But again, tough one to find in this format, but you can get it in some of these other formats. Okay, here's where we get maybe a little bit more interesting, and that is because these final two out of the six were put out on 16 RPM, I would say well before, for the most part, well before they were actually released in any other format. And I find that to be pretty interesting because some of those other ones were, really felt like they were compilations of titles that had already existed or stuff that pre-existed on 78 RPM. These next two, not so much. So this next one that I want to talk about is this one right here. And this one is titled, I suppose, Modern Jazz Survey and New York Jazz. I think Modern Jazz Survey might have been sort of a series that they were trying to start because the next two actually have that name in them. But anyway, New York Jazz, and you've got, as referenced here on the cover, George Wallington, Phil Woods, Donald Byrd, and Red Garland. Now, again, this is across what was supposed to be two different albums, two completely different lineups. So even though this is not previously released in a compilation, it still really was sort of disparate sessions that make this album up. So, obviously have a look at that, have a look at the cover. This one was also put out in 1957. And so this is kind of where, again, this is sort of where we get interesting. So, one of those sessions was released later as New York Jazz on the New Jazz label in 1959. So we had to wait 2 years for that, right? This came out in 1957, wait 2 years. You get New York Jazz, which I think for the most part is credited to George Wallington. So anyway, you can get it on New Jazz, but this is one of those situations where actually this title is way less expensive than finding a copy of New York Jazz on the New Jazz label. That one is just impossible to find. I don't think you can get it for less than maybe even like $700 or $800 these days, right? But this title, when it comes up, usually you can get for like 100, 150, something like that. I think I've seen a few examples where it goes for more. So anyway, New York Jazz is one of those albums that this was later, the music was put out on, and the other one was Phil Woods's, how's it pronounced? Sugan, Sugan. So this one was put out in, what year was it? 1965. And I do believe that was that title was a Status Records pressing. And so, if you're interested in having a playable title of some of this stuff, then I would kind of say that this is maybe your best bet, because a lot of those status pressings were made on recycled vinyl, a lot of hiss, not necessarily the best quality. So I do find it interesting, again, that something that was put out in 1965 originally was put out here in 1957 as part of this 16 RPM series. All right, and the last one in this series of 6 is right here. That is Modern Jazz Survey Baritones and French Horns. So you can see here who's credited: Pepper Adams, Cecil Payne, Julius Watkins, and Dave Amram. So a couple of things, I suppose, about this one that I find interesting, both in terms of, well, mostly I think in terms of what they later became. And that's because we had to wait even a little bit longer. So I've seen evidence that this might have been put out possibly as late as 1958, where some of the other releases are 1957. Keep in mind, we still have the same, the same Fireworks label and address as the others, the same white label. So that gives us some cues anyway. But anyway, the album content that makes up this this particular album is 2 again, and what's really interesting is that one of them is John Coltrane's Dakar. So if you know that album, well, obviously you know what I just said. It's credited to John Coltrane. And on this, you don't see him up top. Where you see him is down below in some of the supporting cast. John Coltrane, Hampton Hawes, just says Shihab, and Curtis Fuller. And obviously there's a lot of really stellar musicians on this album. But this album, or Dakar, would not see the light of day until 1963, when it was put out by Prestige. I think that was a Trident era label. So, you know, after the Fireworks label. And that was also one of those titles, right, that came out in like a variety of cover formats in terms of the colors that they chose to use. And there's a little bit of controversy in terms of understanding which is first. So anyway, I find it interesting that this Pepper Adams and Cecil Payne record, that because Pepper Adams and Cecil Payne are considered the leaders here, later that it was credited to John Coltrane. All right, so that is one half of the 2, and the other half is credited here to Julius Watkins and Dave Amram, and that actually was later released as Curtis Fuller and Hampton Hawes's album that was simply titled With French Horns. That was released on Status as well in 1965. So now we have Sugan and we have this With French Horns album that were both put out later for the first time in 33 RPM on Status Records, which is notorious for poor pressing quality and recycled vinyl. So I mentioned I was going to bring back the cover of Concord, and that is because that album, the With French Horns album, recycled this cover imagery. They used this on it. And so what's really interesting about that, and this is just a nerdy thing, is that you had to recall the fact that it was originally part of 16 RPM, and then recall that not on the album that the source material is on, but on a different album from 16 RPM, on Concord, they decided to use that imagery and pull it through and use it on this With French Horns cover. So anyway, I find this series fascinating. As I said up front, I don't break out my turntable that has the capability to play this very frequently. Now, I know what would be perfect is if I had a turntable that had the variable speed and I could just adjust it essentially on a dime, theoretically not have to worry about swapping out belts and things, and I could just play it whenever I wanted to. You can use your same stylus on 16 and 2/3 RPM as you can on 33 and on 45. But I just, right for the moment, I'm running on vintage equipment, and I keep that turntable in the closet most of the time, except for those few times of the year when I decide to play 16 RPM and possibly 78, right? Because I use it for both of those, although obviously swapping out the cartridges between those two formats. So it isn't as frequent that I play these albums, and yet I'm still fascinated by them. I still love having them in this format. And actually, I don't have the later 33 RPM versions of some of this content. And so in some situations, this is the only copies that I have. And yeah, I mean, it's just kind of fun. It's kind of like a weird novelty, and obviously Prestige abandoned it after these 6 albums. It didn't become that modern jazz thing that they were going for. And now it's sort of... the format's lost to time. I mean, you might come across some content on 16 RPM. More often than not, it's going to be spoken word, maybe not that interesting for you. But I still, you know, I'm still find it fun to have collected these few titles that Prestige put out. So hopefully somebody out there learned something they didn't know, perhaps about this history. And yeah, not as many people are watching this stuff on Discogs or looking for it in stores. I mean, I'm actually surprised. I think 3 of these I found in store, and the other 3 I got online. So you know, it's out there. And I think most people see the 16 RPM and they just look the other way because they have no idea what they're going to do with it. So anyway, thanks for sticking with me once again. Please hit subscribe. Please follow me at what_can_brown on Instagram, and I'll see you next time.